The autumn wind rattled the windows of the old Langley mansion as attorney Benjamin Hayes cleared his throat, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. The mahogany table was surrounded by faces etched with greed and suspicion, the surviving members of what was once Virginia's most prosperous farming dynasty. "Before we begin," Hayes announced, his voice echoing in the dimly lit study, "I must inform you all that Ezekiel Langley's will contains unusual provisions." Margaret Langley, the eldest daughter, shifted uncomfortably in her chair. At 72, she had waited decades for this moment. "Just read the damn thing, Benjamin. We've all been patient enough." Her younger brother, Thomas, 68 and weathered from years of drinking, laughed bitterly. "Patient? You've been circling like a vulture since father took ill." "That's enough," snapped David Langley, Margaret's son and the family's apparent heir. "Let's hear what grandfather left us." Hayes opened the leather-bound document, its pages yellowed with age. "I, Ezekiel Langley, being of sound mind and body... He paused, glancing at the assembled family. "Do hereby bequeath my estate of 15,000 acres and all assets therein, to be divided equally among my surviving children, with one condition." The room fell silent except for the persistent howling of wind through the eaves. "The condition states that the inheritance can only be claimed by the last surviving member of the Langley bloodline. Until such time, the estate shall remain in trust, managed by the designated executor." Margaret's face flushed crimson. "That's impossible." "He can't force us to." "There's more," Hayes interrupted. "The will explicitly states that any attempt to contest these terms will result in complete forfeiture of all claims to the Langley fortune." Thomas slammed his fist on the table, causing the crystal decanter to rattle. 15,000 acres, worth millions, and the old bastard turns it into some sick game of survival. David's wife, Sarah, spoke for the first time, her voice barely above a whisper. "There has to be a mistake. Grandfather wouldn't." "Wouldn't what?" Thomas turned his bloodshot eyes toward her. "Turn his own family against each other. You obviously didn't know Ezekiel Langley very well." Margaret stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the hardwood floor. "This is exactly what he wanted, isn't it? To watch us tear each other apart from beyond the grave." "Perhaps," Hayes said solemnly, "but the will is legally binding. I've reviewed it thoroughly." The storm outside intensified, and the lights flickered momentarily. In that brief darkness, something seemed to shift in the room's atmosphere, a coldness that penetrated deeper than the November chill. "How many of us are there?" asked David quietly. Hayes consulted his notes. "Present here tonight, Margaret, Thomas, David, Sarah, and..." He looked toward the corner where 17-year-old Emma Langley sat silently. "Emma, Thomas's daughter. 5 people," Margaret calculated aloud. 5 people between me and what's rightfully mine." "What's rightfully ours, you mean," Thomas corrected, his voice taking on a dangerous edge. Emma finally spoke, her young voice trembling. "Daddy, I'm scared. This doesn't feel right." Thomas softened slightly at his daughter's words. "Don't worry, sweetheart. Everything will work out." But as Hayes gathered his papers and prepared to leave, he couldn't shake the feeling that Ezekiel Langley had orchestrated something far more sinister than a simple inheritance dispute. The old man had been found dead in his study 3 days ago, and despite the doctor's ruling of natural causes, there were details that didn't quite add up. "Mr. Hayes," Margaret called as he reached the door. "How exactly will we know when there's only one survivor left?" Hayes paused, his hand on the brass doorknob. "I suppose time will tell, Mrs. Langley. Time will tell." As the attorney's car disappeared into the storm, the 5 remaining Langleys sat in uncomfortable silence, each lost in their own dark thoughts. Outside, the wind seemed to carry whispers of the past, echoes of previous disputes, ancient grudges, and blood feuds that had plagued the family for generations. Margaret was the first to break the silence. "Well, I suppose we'll all be seeing much more of each other now." Her smile was cold as winter moonlight, and somewhere in the shadows of the mansion, it seemed as though old Ezekiel Langley was smiling too. 3 months earlier, the morning sun cast long shadows across the Langley estate as Ezekiel Langley, despite his 87 years, walked the perimeter of his land with surprising vigor. His weathered hands traced the ancient oak fence posts that had marked the family's territory for over a century. "Tell me again, grandfather," David said, struggling to keep pace with the old man's determined stride, "why you refused to sell the eastern fields to the developers." Ezekiel stopped abruptly, his steel-gray eyes fixing on a particular section of the fence where the wood appeared darker, almost stained. "Because this land has been paid for with Langley blood, boy, every acre of it." David followed his grandfather's gaze to the darkened wood. "What do you mean?" "Sit down, David. It's time you learned the real history of this family." They found a fallen log beneath the ancient oak that had stood sentinel over the property for 2 centuries. Ezekiel's voice took on the cadence of a man who had told this story many times, if only to himself. "It was 1847 when my great-grandfather Jeremiah Langley first set foot on this land. He wasn't alone. His brother Isaiah came with him, fleeing some trouble back in Pennsylvania. Together, they built the first cabin, cleared the first fields, survived the first harsh winter." The old man's fingers traced patterns in the dirt as he spoke. "For 5 years they worked side by side. But then they discovered what lay beneath the soil." "Gold?" David asked. Ezekiel shook his head. "Something far more valuable in those days, coal. A rich vein running right through the heart of what would become our property." That's when the partnership ended. A hawk circled overhead, its cry piercing the morning air. Ezekiel watched it with knowing eyes before continuing. "Jeremiah claimed the coal rights belonged to him since he'd found them. Isaiah argued that they were equal partners in everything. The dispute lasted months, growing more bitter with each passing day. What happened?" "What always happens when men let greed poison their hearts," Ezekiel replied grimly. "Isaiah disappeared one October night. Some say he left for California, but Jeremiah never spoke of his brother again. Strange thing, though, after that night, Jeremiah's fields always seemed to grow better, more fertile than anyone else's in the county." David felt a chill despite the warm morning sun. "You don't think ... quotes. I think a lot of things, boy. I think Isaiah Langley never left this land. I think his bones are part of what makes our soil so rich. And I think that's where the curse began." "Curse?" David tried to laugh, but the sound came out hollow. "Grandfather, you can't seriously believe, can't I?" Ezekiel stood, brushing dirt from his hands. "Tell me, David, have you ever noticed how this family can't seem to stay united? How we always turn on each other when it matters most?" David had noticed. The feuds, the resentments, the way family gatherings always ended in arguments. He'd attributed it to normal family dynamics, but now, "Your great-great-uncle Isaiah was just the beginning," Ezekiel continued. "In 1863, during the Civil War, 2 of Jeremiah's sons killed each other in a duel over who would inherit the coal mine. In 1891, my own grandfather poisoned his sister rather than share the profits from a new railroad deal. They walked back toward the house, passing the family cemetery where weathered headstones marked generations of Langleys. Many of the dates were suspiciously close together." "Why are you telling me this now?" David asked. Ezekiel stopped at the cemetery gate, his hand resting on the rusted iron. "Because I'm dying, David, and because I've made a decision that will either break this family's curse or complete it once and for all." "What kind of decision?" The old man's smile was cryptic. "You'll find out soon enough. But remember what I've told you today. Remember that this land has a hunger, and it's fed on Langley blood for generations." As they reached the house, Margaret emerged from the front door, her face drawn with concern. "Father," the doctor called. "He wants to see you this afternoon." "About those test results?" Ezekiel nodded, unsurprised. "I'll be there." But as he climbed the porch steps, he turned back to David one last time. "Boy, when the time comes, and you'll know when that is, remember that some hungers can never be satisfied. They can only be ended." That evening, Ezekiel sat in his study, writing by lamplight. The will he crafted was unlike any other part. Legal document, part confession, part challenge to fate itself. He knew what he was setting in motion, knew the terrible price his family would pay. But perhaps, he thought as he signed his name with a trembling hand, it was the only way to break a cycle that had claimed too many lives already. Outside, storm. Clouds gathered on the horizon, and somewhere in the darkness, it seemed as though the land itself was listening, waiting for what was to come. 2 weeks after the will reading, the knock came at Margaret's door at 3 in the morning, sharp and insistent. She stumbled through her darkened hallway, her nightgown trailing behind her, and found Thomas standing on her porch, rain-soaked. And wild-eyed, "Thomas? What in God's name?" "He's gone, Margaret." Thomas pushed past her into the house, dripping water onto the hardwood floor. "David's gone." Margaret's blood ran cold. "Gone where? What are you talking about?" "His car went off the bridge at Miller's Creek. They found it this morning, completely submerged." Thomas collapsed into her living room chair, his hands shaking. "The sheriff says it looks like he lost control in the storm." "Was he ... double quotes Margaret couldn't finish the sentence. "Dead, trapped inside when the car went under." Thomas looked up at his sister, his eyes filled with a mixture of grief and something else, something that looked almost like relief. "Sarah's at the hospital. She's not taking it well." Margaret poured herself a glass of whiskey with trembling hands. "It was an accident, Thomas. A terrible accident. Was it?" Thomas stood and began pacing the room. "Think about it, Margaret. David was the most careful driver I ever knew. He'd driven that route 1,000 times, storm or no storm. What are you suggesting?" Thomas stopped pacing and fixed her with a stare that made her stomach turn. "I'm suggesting that maybe David got tired of waiting. Maybe he decided to even the odds a little. That's insane. David would never, wouldn't he? He was broke, Margaret. Lost everything in that real estate deal last year. The inheritance was his only way out." Margaret set down her glass with a sharp click. "If you're implying that David killed himself to somehow improve his chances of inheriting, you're crazier than I thought. I'm not saying he killed himself." Thomas's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "I'm saying maybe someone else did it for him. Or maybe someone else decided to improve their own odds." The accusation hung in the air between them like poison gas. Margaret felt her face flush with anger. "If you're accusing me of murdering my own son, I'm not accusing anyone of anything. I'm just saying that now there are only 4 of us left." They stood in silence for a long moment, the implication settling over them like a shroud. Finally, Margaret spoke. "We need to be at the funeral. We need to support Sarah." "Do we?" Thomas asked. "Or do we need to start watching our backs?" The funeral was held 3 days later under a gray November sky that seemed to press down on the mourners like a lead blanket. Sarah stood at the graveside supported by 2 of her friends, her face a mask of grief and shock. Emma held her father's arm, clearly frightened by the whole situation. As the pastor spoke about David's life and service to the community, Margaret found herself studying the faces around her. Was Thomas right? Had David's death really been an accident, or was it the first move in a deadly game? After the service, as the family gathered at Sarah's house for the reception, Margaret cornered her daughter-in-law in the kitchen. "Sarah, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me." Sarah looked up from the sandwich platter she was arranging, her eyes red-rimmed from crying. "What is it, Margaret?" "The night David died, did he say anything unusual? Anything about the inheritance, or the family, or—" He was scared, Sarah said quietly. He'd been scared ever since we left the lawyer's office. He kept saying that grandfather had set something terrible in motion. Margaret felt ice in her veins. Scared of what? He wouldn't say exactly. But he did mention that he'd been having dreams about the old cemetery on the property. Dreams about his great-great-uncle Isaiah. Isaiah? Margaret's voice was barely a whisper. How did David know about Isaiah? Your father told him. The day before he died. David came home talking about curses and blood feuds, and how the land was hungry. Sarah's hands trembled as she spoke. Margaret, what if grandfather's will wasn't just about money? What if it was about something else entirely? Before Margaret could answer, Thomas appeared in the doorway, his face grim. Ladies, we have a problem. The sheriff's here, and he wants to talk to all of us. Sheriff Morrison was a large man with kind eyes and a no-nonsense manner. He gathered the remaining family members in Sarah's living room and pulled out a small notebook. Folks, I've got some questions about David's accident. The state police finished their investigation this morning, and there are some things that don't add up. What kind of things? Margaret asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know. Well, for starters, David's car had been tampered with. Someone loosened the lug nuts on his front wheels. It's a miracle he made it as far as he did before losing control. The room fell silent except for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. Emma began to cry softly. Now, I'm not saying this was murder, the sheriff continued, but it sure wasn't an accident either. I need to know if David had any enemies, anyone who might have wanted to hurt him. Thomas and Margaret exchanged glances, and Margaret realized that the game Ezekiel had set in motion was far deadlier than any of them had imagined. Sheriff, she said carefully, I think there's something you need to know about our family. 1 week after David's funeral, the police investigation had turned up nothing conclusive. No witnesses, no fingerprints on David's car, no clear motive beyond the inheritance dispute. Sheriff Morrison had questioned each family member extensively, but without solid evidence, he could only warn them to be careful and keep the case open. Margaret sat in her deceased father's study, surrounded by decades of family documents and photographs. She'd been avoiding this room since the will reading, but David's death had forced her to confront the family's dark history. The leather-bound journals she discovered in Ezekiel's desk painted a picture far more disturbing than even Thomas's paranoid theories. 1847. Isaiah troubles continue, must take action soon. 1863. The boys' quarrel has escalated beyond reason. May God forgive me for what I must do. 1891. Martha grows suspicious of the mining operations. Family unity requires sacrifice. Entry. After entry documented the deliberate elimination of family members who threatened the estate's prosperity. Margaret's hands shook as she read her father's final entry, dated just days before his death. The time has come to end this cycle. The land has fed on Langley blood for too long. My will shall either break the curse or complete it once and for all. Let the last survivor inherit not just the estate, but the terrible truth of what we have become. A knock at the study door interrupted her reading. Come in, she called, quickly closing the journal. Sarah entered, looking gaunt and hollow-eyed. Margaret, I need to talk to you about something. Of course, dear. Sit down. Sarah remained standing, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. I've been thinking about David's accident, and I think I know who killed him. Margaret's blood ran cold. Sarah, you shouldn't. It was Thomas, wasn't it? Sarah's voice was barely above a whisper. He killed David, and now he's going to kill the rest of us until only he and Emma are left. What makes you think that? The night before David died, I saw Thomas's truck parked at the end of our driveway around midnight. When I asked David about it the next morning, he just said they'd had a talk about family business. Margaret felt the pieces clicking into place. Thomas had always been the most desperate of them, the most willing to cross moral lines for money. His alcoholism had cost him job after job, and Emma's college tuition was coming due. "Sarah, listen to me carefully. We need to." The front door slammed, and heavy footsteps echoed through the house. "Margaret," Thomas's voice boomed from the hallway. "We need to talk." Sarah grabbed Margaret's arm, her eyes wide with terror. "He knows I know. Oh God, he's going to kill us both." Margaret pushed Sarah toward the study's back door. "Go. Take my car and drive to the sheriff's office. Tell Morrison everything. What about you? I'll handle Thomas." "Go." Sarah slipped out the back as Thomas entered the study, his face flushed with alcohol and rage. "Where is she, Margaret? Where's who? Don't play dumb with me. I saw Sarah's car in your driveway. I know she's been filling your head with lies about me." Margaret tried to project calm authority. "Thomas, you're drunk. Go home and sleep it." "Off? Drunk?" Thomas laughed bitterly. "Maybe, but not so drunk that I can't see what's happening here. Sarah's trying to turn us against each other. Can't you see that? By telling the truth about what you did to David." Thomas's face went pale. "I didn't. Margaret, you can't seriously believe I would kill my own nephew. Then explain why your truck was at his house the night he died." For a moment, Thomas looked, genuinely confused, then understanding dawned in his eyes. "She told you that?" "Margaret, I wasn't anywhere near David's house that night. I was at Mickey's bar until closing time. There are a dozen witnesses." Margaret felt a chill run down her spine. If Thomas was telling the truth, then who had Sarah seen in his truck? Think about it, Margaret. Who benefits most from turning us against each other? Who's been playing the grieving widow while quietly manipulating all of us? Sarah's not even a blood relative. She can't inherit, can't she? What if she's pregnant? What if she's carrying David's child? A child who would be a legitimate heir to the Langley fortune. The possibility hit Margaret like a physical blow. In all the chaos following David's death, she hadn't considered that Sarah might be carrying the next generation of Langleys. "Even if that were true," Margaret said slowly, "she'd still have to wait for the rest of us to die." Thomas's smile was grim. "Unless she helps the process along. Think about it. She had access to David's car, knew his routines, and now she's trying to convince us that I'm the killer. She's setting us up to destroy each other while she sits back and watches." Margaret's mind raced. Could Sarah really be capable of such calculated evil? The grieving widow act, the frightened accusations, the convenient timing of her revelations, it all suddenly seemed too perfect, too orchestrated. "There's only one way to know for sure," Thomas said. "We need to search her house, see if we can find evidence of her pregnancy or any other proof of what she's planning. And if we're wrong, if you're the killer after all?" Thomas met her eyes steadily. "Then I guess you'll have to decide whether to trust your brother or your daughter-in-law. But Margaret, if I'm right about Sarah, then she's not done killing. She won't stop until she's the last one standing." Outside, storm clouds gathered once again over the Langley estate, and somewhere in the darkness, someone was indeed planning the next move in a deadly game that had already claimed too many lives. The next evening, Margaret and Thomas crept through the darkened rooms of Sarah's house, their flashlights casting eerie shadows on the walls. Sarah had left for her sister's house in Richmond, claiming she needed time away from the estate to grieve. Properly, the timing seemed too convenient to be coincidental. "Check the bedroom," Margaret whispered. "Look for anything: medical pregnancy tests, doctor's appointments, prescription bottles." Thomas nodded and disappeared down the hallway while Margaret searched the living room. David's belongings were still scattered throughout the house, creating a shrine to his memory that felt almost theatrical in its perfection. "Margaret, you need to see this." Thomas's voice was tight with tension. She found him in the master bedroom, holding a small stack of papers he discovered in Sarah's jewelry box. "What is it?" "Pregnancy test results. Positive, dated 2 weeks before David's death." Thomas handed her another document. And this a life insurance policy on David worth $2 million, taken out just 3 months ago. Margaret's hands trembled as she read the papers. She knew. She knew about the baby and the inheritance when she sat in that lawyer's office, pretending to be shocked by grandfather's will. There's more. Thomas pulled out a leather journal, its pages filled with Sarah's neat handwriting. Listen to this. The old man's will is perfect. With David gone, I'll have the legitimate heir to the Langley fortune. All I need to do is eliminate the others before the baby is born. They'll never suspect the grieving widow. My God. Margaret sank onto the bed, the full scope of Sarah's betrayal washing over her. She killed David for the insurance money and to secure the inheritance for her unborn child. It gets worse. Look at this entry from last week. Margaret and Thomas are getting suspicious. Need to accelerate the timeline. The cemetery might be the perfect place. Make it look like they killed each other in a fit of family rage. A sound from downstairs made them both freeze. Car doors slamming, footsteps on the front porch. Thomas grabbed Margaret's arm and pulled her toward the bedroom window. She's back, he whispered. And she's not alone. They could hear voices downstairs, Sarah's, and a man's they didn't recognize. Margaret and Thomas crept to the top of the stairs, straining to listen. Double quotes ... confirmed that they were here, the man was saying. Neighbors saw the flashlights about an hour ago. Perfect, Sarah replied, her voice cold and businesslike nothing. Like the grieving widow act she'd been performing. Did you plant the evidence in Thomas's truck? Guns in the glove compartment, registered to him. Suicide notes in his handwriting, confessing to David's murder and expressing his intention to kill Margaret before taking his own life. Margaret felt ice in her veins. They'd walked into a trap. What about the girl? The man asked. Emma? Sarah's laugh was cruel. She'd be the sole survivor, traumatized by her father's murder-suicide rampage. Easy enough to manipulate, especially with a baby on the way who'll need a guardian. Thomas's face went white. Emma, they're going to use Emma as their pawn. Margaret grabbed his arm as he started toward the stairs. Thomas, we can't just... My daughter is in danger. I don't care what happens to me. But before he could move, they heard the front door open again and Emma's voice calling out. Mrs. Langley? Dad said you wanted to see me. Sarah's voice was suddenly sweet and concerned. Emma dear, thank you for coming. Your father and Margaret are in the study. They wanted to talk to you about the inheritance. Margaret and Thomas exchanged horrified glances. Sarah was luring Emma into whatever trap she'd prepared. We have to get down there, Thomas whispered. They crept down the stairs, staying in the shadows. Through the study doorway, they could see Emma standing in the center of the room, looking around nervously. Where are they? Emma asked. They'll be here in just a moment, Sarah said from behind her. But first, there's something I need to tell you about your family's history. Margaret saw the glint of metal in Sarah's hand. A small revolver pointed at Emma's back. Emma, run! Margaret shouted, bursting into the room. Everything happened. At once, Emma spun around, saw the gun, and screamed. Sarah fired, but Margaret's warning had given Emma time to move. The bullet shattered a window instead of finding its target. Thomas charged from the opposite direction, tackling Sarah to the ground. The gun flew across the room, sliding under the desk. The unknown man appeared in the doorway, but Emma grabbed a heavy bookend and struck him in the head before he could interfere. Call the police. Margaret shouted to Emma as she helped Thomas restrain Sarah. But Sarah was laughing, her face twisted with malicious joy. You think this changes anything? Even if you stop me tonight, the curse will continue. The land is hungry, and it will have its due. What curse? Emma demanded, her young face pale with terror. Sarah's eyes gleamed with fanatic intensity. The Langley curse, you foolish child. Every generation, The family destroys itself fighting over this estate. Your great-great-uncle Isaiah was just the beginning. The land drinks Langley blood, and it always has. Thomas pressed his knee harder against Sarah's back. You're insane. Am I? How many Langleys have died violently over the past century? How many have turned on their own family for money and power? Sarah turned her head to look directly at Emma. You're the last of the pure bloodline, girl. When you die, the Langley name dies with you, and my child will inherit everything. Margaret felt a chill that had nothing to do with the November air. What do you mean, pure bloodline? Sarah's smile was triumphant. I'm not David's widow, you fools. I'm his half-sister. Ezekiel's bastard daughter, come home to claim what's rightfully mine. The revelation hit them like a physical blow. Ezekiel's secret had spawned one final deadly twist in the family's dark saga. Later that night, Sheriff Morrison arrived with 3 deputy cars, their red and blue lights painting the Langley estate in hellish colors. Sarah's accomplice, a drifter named Jack Reeves, whom she'd hired to help stage the murder-suicide, was unconscious and bleeding from Emma's well-aimed blow. Sarah herself sat in handcuffs on the living room couch, still wearing that disturbing smile. Mrs. Langley, Sheriff Morrison addressed Margaret, I need you to start from the beginning. Tell me everything that happened here tonight. As Margaret recounted the evening's events, Thomas held Emma close, his daughter still shaking from the trauma. But it was Sarah's final revelation that haunted them all her claim to be Ezekiel's illegitimate daughter and David's half-sister. Sheriff, Thomas interrupted, we need to verify her story. If she's telling the truth about being father's daughter, then everything we thought we knew about the inheritance is wrong. Morrison nodded grimly. We'll run DNA tests, but that'll take time. For now, she's under arrest for attempted murder and conspiracy. Mr. Reeves is going to the hospital under guard. Sarah laughed from her position on the couch. DNA tests won't change anything. I have birth certificates, hospital records, even letters from dear old Daddy. He kept me as his dirty little secret for 34 years, but he never forgot about me. Margaret felt sick. When did you know? I've known since I was 16. My mother finally told me the truth about why we received those monthly checks. Ezekiel Langley's guilt money, paying for his bastard daughter's upbringing. Sarah's eyes glittered with hatred. I've been watching this family for years, planning my revenge. So you seduced David, Thomas said, his voice filled with disgust. Your own half-brother. David was weak, desperate for love and acceptance. It was almost too easy. Though I must admit, the pregnancy was an unexpected bonus. A legitimate heir to carry on the Langley name, even if the bloodline is compromised. Emma spoke for the first time since the police arrived, her voice small and frightened. Does this mean the baby will inherit everything? Sheriff Morrison looked uncomfortable. That's a legal question, miss. You'll need to talk to a lawyer about how this affects the will. Attorney Benjamin Hayes arrived an hour later, looking haggard and exhausted. After reviewing the situation, he sat down heavily in Ezekiel's old chair. This is a legal nightmare, he admitted. If Sarah's claim of parentage is verified, then her child would indeed be a legitimate Langley heir. But given her criminal actions, what are options? Margaret asked. We can contest the will on the grounds that Ezekiel couldn't have anticipated these circumstances. But that could take years to resolve, and there's no guarantee of success. Thomas slammed his fist on the desk. So this psychopath gets to profit from murder? Not necessarily, Hayes said carefully. There are laws preventing criminals from profiting from their crimes. But the child, that's more complicated. As the night wore on, the full scope of Sarah's deception became clear. She'd been planning David's murder for months, carefully orchestrating events to make it look like an accident while positioning herself as the innocent victim. The pregnancy had been her ace in the hole, a way to claim the inheritance even if her true identity was discovered. There's something else, Sarah said as they prepared to transport her to jail. Something none of you know about dear grandfather's final days. Margaret looked up sharply. What do you mean? I visited him the night before he died. Had a lovely chat about family history, about curses and blood feuds and the price of greed. Sarah's smile was pure malice. He knew who I was, you see. Knew what I was planning. And he was so very proud of his bastard daughter's determination to claim her birthright. You're lying, Emma whispered. Am I? Who do you think suggested? The inheritance structure in the first place? Who gave me the idea to eliminate the competition one by one? Sarah leaned forward as far as her handcuffs would allow. Ezekiel Langley didn't write that will to break a curse, you foolish children. He wrote it to ensure that the strongest, most ruthless member of the family would inherit everything. And that's exactly what happened. The implication hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Had Ezekiel really conspired with his illegitimate daughter to destroy his legitimate family? Had the old man's final act been one of ultimate betrayal? Even if that's true, Thomas said slowly, you still lost. You're going to prison, and your child will be raised by strangers. Sarah's laugh was soft and knowing. Will it? Emma's still alive, still a threat to my child's inheritance. Prison walls won't protect her forever, and there are others who share my perspective on the Langley legacy. Sheriff Morrison stepped forward. That sounds like a threat, Mrs. Langley. Not a threat, Sheriff. A promise. The curse isn't broken just because you caught me. If anything, it's stronger now. The land has tasted fresh blood, and it's hungry for more. As they led Sarah away, Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from over. The Langley curse, whether real or simply a self-fulfilling prophecy of greed and violence, had claimed another victim. But the bloodline continued, and somewhere in the darkness, new threats were already taking shape. Emma clung to her father's arm as they watched the police cars disappear into the night. Dad, what happens now? Thomas looked out over the vast Langley estate, its fields and forests stretching endlessly under the starlit sky. Somewhere beneath that soil lay the bones of Isaiah Langley and countless others who had died for this land. Now, he said quietly, we decide whether to break the cycle or become part of it. 6 months later, the morning sun cast long shadows across the Langley family cemetery as Margaret placed fresh flowers on David's grave. The headstone was simple granite, bearing only his name and dates, no mention of the violent circumstances of his death or the family secrets that had died with him. Emma approached quietly, carrying her own bouquet. At 18 now, she had aged years in the months since Sarah's arrest and subsequent conviction. The trial had been a media sensation, exposing decades of Langley family dysfunction to the world. Any word from the lawyers? Emma asked, kneeling beside her grandmother's grave marker. Margaret shook her head. The courts are still deciding what to do about Sarah's baby. She gave birth in prison last month, a boy. The state has him in protective custody while they determine guardianship. And the inheritance? Margaret stood, brushing dirt from her hands. Benjamin Hayes thinks it could be tied up in litigation for decades. Sarah's conviction for murder should disqualify her child from inheriting, but her lawyers are arguing that the boy is innocent of his mother's crimes. They walked in silence toward the old oak tree where Ezekiel had once told David about the family's dark history. Thomas joined them there, looking older than his 70 years. The stress of the past months had taken its toll on all of them. I've made a decision, he announced without preamble. I'm selling my share of the estate to the Virginia Land Conservancy. They'll preserve it as protected wilderness, ensure it can never be developed or divided again. Margaret stared at her brother in shock. Thomas, you can't just... I can, and I will. Emma's already agreed. Haven't you, sweetheart? Emma nodded, her young face set with determination that reminded Margaret painfully of her grandfather. The lawyers say that if we all agree to sell, it won't matter what happens with Sarah's baby. The estate will be gone, the inheritance dissolved. And maybe ... maybe the curse will finally be broken. Margaret felt a surge of panic. The Langley estate had been her entire identity for 73 years. Without it, who was she? What about you, Margaret? Thomas asked gently. Will you join us in ending this once and for all? Margaret looked out over the rolling fields and forests that had defined her family for generations. Somewhere beneath that soil lay the bones of Isaiah Langley, the first victim of the family's greed. How many others had died over the years, sacrificed to the insatiable hunger for wealth and power? I need to think about it, she said finally. That afternoon, Margaret walked alone through the mansion that had been her home for most of her life. The rooms were filled with memories, Christmas mornings, birthday parties, family gatherings that had ended in arguments and resentment. The weight of history pressed down on her with each step. In Ezekiel's study, she found herself drawn to his journals once again. She'd read them dozens of times since Sarah's arrest, searching for clues about her father's true motivations. The final entry still haunted her. Let the last survivor inherit not just the estate, but the terrible truth of what we have become. Had Ezekiel really conspired with Sarah to destroy his own family? Or had he simply recognized that the cycle of violence and betrayal could only be broken by someone willing to sacrifice everything? Margaret's phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. It was Benjamin Hayes. Margaret, I have news about Sarah's baby. The court has awarded guardianship to Sarah's sister in California. The child will be raised under an assumed name, with no knowledge of his Langley heritage. And the inheritance? If you, Thomas, and Emma all agree to sell, the matter becomes moot. The estate will be liquidated, debts paid, and the remaining funds distributed equally among the three of you. It's actually quite generous. You'll each receive several million dollars. Several million dollars to walk away from the land that had defined her family for 6 generations. Margaret closed her eyes and tried to imagine a life beyond the Langley estate. That evening, the remaining family gathered in the mansion's dining room for what they all knew would be their last meal together in the old house. The table that had once seated 12 now held only 3: Margaret, Thomas, and Emma. I keep thinking about what grandfather said, Emma spoke quietly. About the land being hungry, about how it fed on Langley blood. Thomas nodded grimly. Sarah proved that. The hunger is real, even if it's not supernatural. Greed and desperation turned her into a monster. But it didn't turn us into monsters, Margaret said suddenly. Despite everything that's happened, we're still here, still together. Maybe that means something. Emma reached across the table and took her grandmother's hand. Maybe it means we're the generation that finally breaks the cycle. Margaret looked at her granddaughter's face, young and hopeful despite everything she'd endured. Then she thought of Sarah's baby, growing up far from the estate, unaware of his cursed heritage. Perhaps that was the real victory, ensuring that the next generation would be free from the poison that had infected the Langley bloodline for so long. All right, Margaret said finally. I'll sign the papers. We'll sell the estate and end this chapter of our family's history. Thomas smiled for the first time in months. So what happens next? Next, Margaret said, looking around the dining room one last time, we write a new story. One that doesn't end in blood and betrayal. 6 months later, Margaret stood on the porch of her new house in Richmond, reading the newspaper article about the Virginia Land Conservancy's acquisition of the former Langley estate. The property would become a nature preserve, its dark history buried beneath walking trails and birdwatching stations. Emma was finishing her first year at Virginia Tech, studying environmental science. Thomas had used his inheritance to enter a rehabilitation program and was 6 months sober. Sarah remained in prison, serving a life sentence for David's murder. And somewhere in California, a little boy with Langley blood in his veins played in a suburban backyard. Unaware that he was the last heir to a legacy of violence and greed, Margaret folded the newspaper and looked out over her new neighborhood. Children played in the streets, families gathered for barbecues, and life continued its normal, peaceful rhythm. For the first time in her life, she felt truly free. The Langley curse was finally broken, not by violence or supernatural intervention, but by the simple act of choosing love over greed, peace over power. The land might still hunger, but it would have to find sustenance elsewhere. The last Langleys had chosen to write their own ending, and it was not written in blood.